सेव किया था ना?
मैं सिर्फ इसलिए गया था क्योंकि उसने मुझे कॉल किया, that's it. But listen तो.
Save it for someone else.
जिंदगी में सेव करना जरूरी है, मगर जब बात पैसों की हो, सिर्फ सेविंग से काम नहीं चलेगा। इक्विटी म्यूचुअल फंड्स में इन्वेस्ट कीजिए और अपने सेविंग्स को आगे बढ़ने का मौका दीजिए।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme-related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Macrosutra. I'm TCA Sharad Raghavan, Deputy Editor at ThePrint, and this time we're going to be talking about the surprisingly good GDP numbers that just came out. But before we start, I have an appeal to make before you, which is it's due to your subscriptions that ThePrint can do the work that we've been doing, the ground reports that we do. We bring you news from around the country that nobody else does. And subscribing to ThePrint also gives you certain advantages, such as the webinars that we do, which are exclusively for our members. We bring on experts and we talk about the news of the day. You can write into us in our Your Turn section, where we publish your comments as a full article. And you get access to our curated newsletters that our editors send directly to your mailboxes. So please do subscribe. The link is in the bio and the description of this video. Thank you so much. And now let's get on with it. We have with us Radhika Pandey, Associate Professor at NIPFP, to explain the GDP numbers to us. Looking at the overall number, how did we do in Q2 compared to Q1 and also Q2 of last year?
So, if we look at the Q2 numbers, the GDP showed a growth of 7.6%. So, and this is a slight moderation from the GDP growth that we saw in the first quarter, that is April to June of this year. GDP registered a growth of 7.8% in the previous quarter. So, there was an expectation that GDP will moderate from the first quarter, but this was an upside surprise, because if we look at the expectation, the projections made, there was this expectation that GDP will range somewhere between 6.8 and 7%.
And the RBI had also said 6.5.
6.5. RBI was 6.5, but the later projections that were made after the high frequency indicators came out for urban consumption or for industry, it showed that, there would be an upside surprise to GDP. But this was, it beat all expectations and by a wide margin, and GDP growth came in at 7.6%. And if we compare it with the corresponding quarter of last year, that is Q2 of FY23, GDP growth was 6.2% in the corresponding quarter of last year.
Right. So now we know that this data overall was a pleasant surprise, an upside surprise. But were there particular sectors here that were particularly surprising?
The most important sector or the noteworthy growth that we saw in this GDP numbers was on account of the industrial segment, because it was expected that industry will do better as compared to what it did in the first quarter. We spoke about that in the previous in the editions of Macrosutra, when the GDP numbers of the first quarter came out, and that time we discussed that manufacturing sector continues to be a cause of concern. At that time, manufacturing sector had registered a growth of 4.7%, and all the segments of industry had registered a slower growth in the first quarter. But now what we saw in the second quarter, if we look at industry as a whole, it registered a growth of more than 13%. Manufacturing, which is the most dominant part of the industrial segment, registered a growth of 13.9%. So these are all in constant prices. These are not current prices. So this is excluding the impact of inflation. We are getting a double-digit growth in manufacturing. We also got a double-digit growth in construction, also again 13%. So all the major segments of industry reported a remarkable turnaround in the second quarter of this financial year. Now, some part of it was expected, because we can always make these estimations based on high frequency indicators.
Of course.
One of which is the IIP, Index of Industrial Production, which is the volume based production indicator. And it did improve in the second quarter as compared to the first quarter. IIP for the July-September quarter was 7.4%, so which is a decent number as compared to 4.8% in the April to June quarter. So IIP was doing good, but for manufacturing, the most important thing was that there has been an easing of commodity prices as compared to the September quarter of last year. If we remember September of 2022, oil prices were very high, commodity prices were high. So if all these commodity prices are high, that means the input cost pressures lead to a decline in profitability. But that was not the case in this quarter, because as compared to the highs of September 2022, we saw that all commodity prices have registered a moderation. If we see crude oil prices, they have declined. If we see metals and metal price index, so that's an indicator of overall metal prices, which is an important input for various manufacturing industries. There also we have seen a moderation. Food prices, vegetable oils, we have seen a moderation. So all these things have led to a decline in the input cost pressures, leading to improved profitability. So
that's for manufacturing.
Yeah.
But the construction sector, it did well last quarter as well.
Yes.
I mean, the Q2 of last year.
Yes.
And then on this time, it did even better.
Even better. And that could be attributed to the government's capex push. Because if we look at the construction related indicators, we look at steel consumption, it has been growing at a robust pace for many quarters. Cement production has been, there's a seasonality in cement production. But overall here also, if we see cement production, we do see an uptick overall. If we see on a cumulative basis, we do see implications of the government's capex push on construction, which is a very positive feature of this overall GDP number, because construction is the second largest employer in the economy, and if construction does well, it bodes well for the employment situation in the country. So manufacturing did well, construction did well. Surprisingly, mining did well, because this time, July to September, we saw erratic rainfall. So the factor which led to a slowdown in agriculture actually contributed to increase in mining. Because there were less of disruption in mining activities, because rainfall were erratic. There were scarce as compared to what was expected in this quarter. So that was the reason. Electricity did well because of heat. There was a surge in demand for electricity in July, August, which are normally the months where electricity demand slows down. So all these factors contributed to improvement in industry. Although there is a base effect, yes, because the September 2022 industrial sector contracted. But despite that, we do see an improvement in industrial sector based on the high frequency indicators. So we look at the firm level database. We try to replicate the gross value addition for manufacturing sector using the firm database. We also get such encouraging numbers. So it is primarily due to the improved profitability that has given a boost to the gross value addition in the manufacturing sector.
Okay, so we've talked about the various sectors that have done well.
Correct.
You also touched upon the fact that agriculture didn't do as well as expected. Was this surprising or was it expected?
Again, it was expected, and there were these projections that agriculture will slow down to somewhere between 1 and 1.5%. And what we did get in the growth numbers were also on expected lines. So agriculture growth slowed down due to, again, the erratic rainfall, the impact of El Nino, which impacted the sowing of Kharif. That was one of the main factors. And also one of the critical things that here we look at is the arrivals of key crops in mandis. So if people are not hoarding and if they are bringing their entire produce to the market, that is a very good indicator of the production that has happened. And that shows that, leaving aside for rice, we saw that for some of the major crops, the mandi arrivals have actually slowed down in the July-September quarter of this year as compared to July-September quarter of last year. So this is one thing, and even going forward, the outlook remains uncertain, because even for Rabi, the sowing is going out at a slow pace as compared to last year, because there is less of moisture in soil. There is less of irrigation water. Also, the first advance estimates that were released by Ministry of Agriculture shows that Kharif production will be lesser. It might get revised, these numbers, because these are first advance estimates. But if we look at rice production, it is expected to decline by 3.79% in 23-24. So these are the things that do not bode well for the rural economy. They do not bode well for food inflation. So overall, we saw that agriculture sector actually declined to an 18-quarter low, because agriculture has been putting up well even during COVID time.
Absolutely, it was the bright spot.
Yes. So, and now we see that it's fallen to an 18-quarter low.
Ouch. And now coming to the components of GDP.
Right.
So what does the data show about private consumption? It's an important part of GDP. It is one of the engines of the economy.
Right.
So what does the data show?
So here we saw a bit of a surprise, because it was expected that consumption could do better, because at least the urban indicators of consumption were doing well. So if we look at GST collections, we look at passenger vehicle sales, we look at air traffic, all these indicators of urban demand have been doing well. But what we saw in the data was that the private consumption, which is an important almost 60%, though the share of private consumption in GDP has gone down to now 56.3% in the this second quarter. So consumption has slowed down from 6% in the last quarter, that is April to June, to 3.1% in the July-September quarter. And one of the major reasons for this is the sluggishness in the rural demand. Also, if we look at July-September, this was a period when inflation was high. It was above the 6% upper threshold. We remember July was exceptionally bad from inflation perspective, because inflation was 7.44%. Also, if we look at inflation, rural inflation has always surpassed urban inflation. Rural inflation was a bigger problem. So that is what is getting reflected in the consumption numbers, that it may be due to, you can link the agriculture performance and rural economy, and hence private consumption. So, look at the rural demand indicators like tractor sales. We look at the demand for work under Manrega. All the demand for work has remained elevated in July-September quarter, even more than the July-September quarter of last year.
Right.
So that shows that there is a demand for work. They are not getting work. There is distressed employment in the rural economy, and that is what is reflected in even things like FMCG sales in the rural sector. They did not do well. So. Now it is expected in the October-December quarter, because inflation has moderated, and also the festive season this time came in the October-December quarter. So we might see some improvement in consumption. But talking about July-September quarter, yes, consumption is a cause of concern.
Right, and you mentioned Narega, and there were some news reports I remember seeing where the government has sanctioned an emergency 10,000 crores before the parliament session and before they can vote on.
Yes, and in fact that is also not sufficient, because the estimates are that the fund that are required are more than 1 lakh crore. So even so in the budget it was sanctioned 60,000 crore, 10,000 crore more. So there is a problem there. The government might come in sanctioning more amount. So that is a very important indicator which shows distress in the rural economy.
Absolutely. And now the other part, the other components of GDP, the other important one is capital formation.
Correct.
And so how has that been? How has that grown?
Yeah, so that has done well. So if we look at gross fixed capital formation, it saw a growth of 11%, so which is quite encouraging. And again, if we look at the high frequency indicators, we can see that it's again mainly driven by government investment, both center and states. We've talked about state finances also, and we've seen that even states have prioritized their capex. So for the July-September quarter, the central government capex rose by more than 26%. State government capex rose by even higher, by more than 40%. So there is a front loading of capital expenditure happening. Heavy lifting on capital expenditure is being done by both union and state government. So, but what needs to be seen, what happens in the second half. It may, whether it's going to moderate or whether it maintains its current momentum, that will determine the trajectory of growth in the second quarter. considering that consumption has slowed down, so investment will have to do the heavy lifting even in the second half. But it needs to be seen whether we see that.
And especially because the second half leads up to the election and so
yes,
whether they will continue prioritizing capital expenditure.
Yes, so absolutely. Given that the kind of the increase in subsidies that we have seen, the state governments have also stepped up their revenue expenditures. So that could see some implication for capital expenditure, but the data will tell us that.
That actually leads us quite neatly into a question from the audience, which is that do you think the government has switched priorities away from development to freebie politics like UPA 2 did?
So till now, that has not been the case, because if we again see talking first about the union government. So if we talk about the union government, the capital expenditure has increased, and it's now increased to 3.5% of GDP. So till now, capital expenditure remains the priority, and as I mentioned, 26% increase in central government capital expenditure we have seen. But if we look at state governments, yes, we are seeing a lot of freebies. We are seeing a lot of, there has been an increase in minimum support prices that are being offered to farmers, the increase in the subsidies on cooking gas. That is happening, and that is happening by both the dominant parties as well as the regional parties. At the central level, we don't see that mix changing, unfavorably towards revenue expenditure. It still continues to be driven by capital expenditure if we look at the union government finances. But state governments, yes, that is a challenge, and we need to see what happens in the second half of the data. We will see what happens to the finances of the state government. But as of now, these are promises. We need to see how it gets reflected in the data.
Right. And now Sankalp links the data that we have on the industrial sector, the fact that there's been so much growth, to the fact that unemployment still remains high. So he says that recent election surveys show that unemployment remains high on voters' minds, even in states where there's relatively low unemployment. It appears that there are jobs, but there seems to be a mismatch in the ambitions of the youth and what jobs there are on offer. So what more can be done at the policy level to enable reskilling?
Yeah. So one thing is that, there is a plethora of data available on employment, and employment data remains a concern if we look at, and we get conflicting statements or conflicting assessments about the employment situation.
Right.
So if we look at the official data, the periodic labor force survey data, we have seen that the unemployment rate has come down, both for the rural sector and for urban sector in the for 2022-23. So unemployment rate has come down. What is also important is that, the share of regular salaried workers has actually come down, and the share of self-employment has increased. So what Sankalp is talking about of the change in mindset, that there is a mismatch. Everybody wants central government jobs or government jobs, and there are limited in number. So that is something that is causing this mismatch, and what it requires is skilling, obviously, and it also requires a relook at the education policy, the course curricula that we are advocating, whether it is actually instilling skill or not. So these things need to be seen in conjunction. Employment is not just the very isolated problem. There are a lot of things that need to be seen in conjunction. We need to see what's happening to poverty. We need to see what's happening to per capita income, to inflation. A lot of things need to be seen in conjunction. But yes, skilling needs to continue, and the mindset also needs to change, and that is happening. A lot of people are moving towards self-employment. They are moving towards entrepreneurial skills. So those kind of schemes need to have a greater focus in the budget, which promotes entrepreneurship, which promotes advancement of formal credit for employment and skill generation.
There you go. The GDP data actually has come as a pleasant surprise. The number is quite a lot higher than what the RBI had predicted just as recently as in October. The RBI had said 6.5%. The number has come at 7.6%. Even though a lot of high frequency indicators showed that there would be a surprise on the upside, this much was not expected. Manufacturing, mining, electricity, a lot of industrial sectors have done quite well, and that's construction has been a very, very pleasant surprise. The push by the government on building infrastructure seems to really be paying off. On the downside, the erratic rains have meant that the agriculture sector has not grown as strongly as it had during the COVID period, where it was the agriculture sector that was the bright spot. But now it's kind of slowed down, and it's not likely to pick up because the outlook on the monsoon and the sowing area and everything seems to be lower. But the other worrying thing also is that private sector or private consumption, that's household consumption, has come in lower. The growth has been lower. This can directly be linked to the fact that rural demand has been lower because the agricultural growth has not been great. So there are a lot of bright spots in the economy, but also some signs of concern. But on that note, thank you so much for watching.